August 216 BC. On a flat plain in southern Italy, 70,000 Romans died in a single afternoon. Not because they were weak, not because they lacked weapons. They died because they were too confident. More than 2,000 years later, June 1940, the French had just completed the most formidable defensive wall in the world, at a cost of billions of francs and decades of preparation. The Germans looked at that wall, nodded, and went around it. Just 46 days later, Paris fell. And in October 1993, on a narrow street in Mogadishu, Somalia, a meticulously planned mission expected to be over in 30 minutes, but it dragged on for 18 hours. 18 American soldiers were killed. Not long after, the world's most powerful superpower withdrew its forces and went home. 3 stories, 3 different eras, but one common denominator. History has no shortage of great victories, but what is truly sobering and far more worth studying lies in the defeats. Not defeat because the enemy was too strong, but defeat born of arrogance, of no one daring to tell the truth to those in power, of an entire system preparing meticulously for a war completely different from the one actually unfolding right in front of them. In this video, we'll walk through the 10 most humiliating defeats in the history of human warfare. But let's be clear from the start, this is not a video merely retelling history, not a list of battles with casualty figures. Every story today revolves around a single question: what actually went wrong, and who must bear responsibility for it? Because these mistakes don't exist only on the battlefield. They appear anywhere people must make high-stakes decisions under pressure. In the boardroom, in a crisis, in every moment where those who hold power choose to believe what they want to believe, rather than what is actually happening. The story begins 2,200 years ago, on a plain in southern Italy, and with a man named Hannibal Barca, who turned his enemy's own strength into the weapon that destroyed them. Chapter 1. The Battle of Cannae, Rome and Hannibal. To understand why Cannae became the greatest disaster in Roman history, you have to understand who the Romans were before that battle. They were not weak, not inexperienced, and certainly not afraid of war. For hundreds of years, Rome had conquered nearly the entire Italian peninsula using exactly one way of fighting. Form the troops into a dense rectangle. Advance. Drive straight into the enemy. Use discipline, use mass to grind everything in front of them into dust. And the thing is, that method worked. It had won hundreds of battles. It had turned Rome into a war machine that was nearly impossible to stop. When a tactic has made you victorious for so long, you begin to believe it is absolutely correct. No one questions it anymore. No one thinks that one day it might fail. That was the Romans' first mistake, and they had already made it before the Battle of Cannae even began. In 218 BC, a man named Hannibal Barca did something the entire ancient world believed was impossible. He led tens of thousands of soldiers, cavalry, and 37 war elephants across the Alps in the middle of winter. No roads wide enough, no reliable maps, only thick snow, slippery rock, and cold enough to kill anyone unaccustomed to the frozen mountains. Along the way, thousands of soldiers froze to death, horses fell into ravines, most of the war elephants didn't survive the journey either. But Hannibal still reached Italy, And the most terrifying part was this. He didn't come to plunder and retreat. He came to drag the war straight into the heart of Rome. He wanted the Romans to have to fight on their own soil before they had time to prepare, before they could understand what was happening. Over the next 2 years, Hannibal crushed the Roman army twice. The first time, at the Trebia River, he lured the Romans into wading across ice-cold water in the middle of winter. When they reached the other side, clothes soaked through, limbs numb with cold, formation in disarray, Hannibal unleashed his troops straight into them. The Romans barely had time to react. A year later, at Lake Trasimene, Hannibal did something even more devastating. He concealed an entire army in thick morning fog, then ambushed the whole Roman force as they marched along the lake. More than 15,000 men died in less than 3 hours. 2 defeats, tens of thousands of dead, and both times Hannibal had won with exactly the same thing. He knew precisely what the Romans would do before they had even decided it themselves. He set the trap in advance, then waited for them to walk into it. The Romans understood that. They knew they had been beaten the same way twice. But the remarkable thing is, after all those failures, the lesson Rome drew was not to change how they fought. It was, bring more soldiers. The year was 216 BC. The Roman Senate selected 2 consuls to command the army. But there was a problem. These 2 men took turns holding command, each one in charge for 1 day at a time, and that was about to kill tens of thousands of people. The first was Lucius Aemilius Paulus, a seasoned general, careful, patient. He understood very clearly how dangerous Hannibal was. On the days he held command, Paulus avoided battle. He had no desire to walk into the trap Hannibal had already prepared, no desire to let the enemy choose where to fight or when to fight. He waited, observed, kept the army alive. The second was Gaius Terentius Varro, completely different, of common birth, impulsive, hungry for glory, and on his shoulders sat a very human kind of pressure. He needed a victory. Rome had grown exhausted by the endless war. The people wanted it over. Varro wanted to be the man who made that happen, the hero of Rome. August 2nd, 216 BC, was Varro's day. He looked out at his army, 86,000 men, among them 70,000 fully equipped Roman infantry, a colossal force. Then he looked across to the other side, around 50,000 Carthaginian troops, many of them merely mercenaries drawn from all manner and different tribes. On paper, Rome was overwhelmingly superior. The numbers were too clear, the logic too simple. Varro believed today would be the day Hannibal was crushed, and he gave the order to attack. Paulus objected. He worried about the terrain, worried about the Carthaginian cavalry stronger on both flanks, and above all, he worried about exactly the things that the 2 previous defeats had tried to teach Rome. But that day was not Paulus's day. And so, 86,000 Romans began to advance. Hannibal knew the Romans would attack, and he also knew they would use exactly the same tactic they always had: concentrate all their weight in the center, drive straight forward, grind the enemy down through sheer frontal pressure. But Hannibal had already prepared for that. He did something that almost no one would have thought of. At the very center of his formation, Hannibal placed his weakest soldiers, Gauls, Spaniards. They stood pushed forward at the front like an exposed lure. And on both flanks were his finest African infantry from Carthage. They didn't move, didn't attack. They simply stood there and waited. On the outermost edges were the Carthaginian cavalry, faster, stronger, and more dangerous than the Roman cavalry on either side. Then Varro ordered the attack. The entire massive Roman block of infantry surged straight into the Carthaginian center. The Gallic and Spanish soldiers began to fall back, step by step, under control, exactly as Hannibal had planned from the beginning. Seeing the enemy retreat, Varro believed he was winning. He ordered the entire force to keep pressing forward, faster, harder, deeper. And that was the moment the trap closed. The further they drove into the retreating center, the more the Roman formation warped out of shape. They were crushed in against one another, rows behind, shoving rows ahead, man against man, shield against shield, no space left to turn around, no room left to fight. Then, just as the Roman formation had gone deep enough, tightly packed enough, chaotic enough, the two flanks of African infantry began to move, not forward, but inward, slowly, coldly, precisely, like two enormous arms closing around their prey. At the same time, the Carthaginian cavalry shattered the Roman cavalry on the outside. Then they slung around and came back, attacking from the rear. Now the Romans were locked in from every direction. In front, the enemy. On both sides, the enemy. Behind them, also the enemy. No way out. In less than a few hours, 86,000 Romans were trapped inside a perfect cage. This is what made the Battle of Cannae different from every other battle. The Roman soldiers did not die because they fought poorly. They died because there was no longer any room to fight. The formation was packed so tightly, a soldier couldn't even raise his arm to thrust a spear, couldn't draw his sword, couldn't turn around, couldn't run. They were compressed into one another amid screaming, the clash of metal, and panic spreading through the entire mass. Meanwhile, the Carthaginian forces kept tightening the ring from the outside, layer by layer, layer by layer. The Romans at this point were no longer an army. They were simply a trapped mass of men incapable of defending themselves. Historians estimate that over roughly 8 hours, the Carthaginians killed an average of more than 8,000 Roman soldiers every hour. Think about that number. Every hour. An entire army disappearing. Then the sun began to set over the plain of Cannae. Around 70,000 Romans lay there when it was over. Among them was Lucius Aemilius Paulus, the consul who had opposed the battle from the very beginning. Hundreds of senior officers. This was not merely a military defeat. This was the day Rome's entire ruling class was wiped out in a single afternoon, because Rome had thrown nearly everything it had into this one battle. Gaius Terentius Varro survived. He fled back to Rome with a few thousand men remaining. The Carthaginians lost around 6,000, a disparity so staggering it barely resembled a battle anymore. It resembled an extermination. The real question is not how gifted Hannibal was. The real question is why the Romans, after losing twice in exactly the same way, still walked straight into a third trap. And the answer lies in something very human. The Romans were not short of information. They knew Hannibal favored cunning. They knew the two previous defeats came from being drawn in and outmaneuvered. They even had Paulus, a man who understood very clearly the danger waiting ahead. He had tried to stop it. But what Rome lacked was not knowledge. It was the capacity to doubt themselves. Over hundreds of years of warfare, the Romans had built a belief that was nearly absolute in their own way of fighting. And that belief was not without foundation. It had been created from hundreds of genuine victories. That is precisely what made it dangerous, because when a belief has been confirmed too many times, people begin to think it can no longer be wrong. When Varro looked at 86,000 Roman troops and only around 50,000 of Hannibal's, he didn't see a trap. He saw an arithmetic problem, and in his mind, that problem had only one answer: victory. But Hannibal was different. He didn't defeat Rome through brute force. He defeated them through understanding. He understood what the Romans would think, how they would react, and most importantly, he understood what they would not see. Hannibal didn't ask himself, "Am I stronger than them?" He asked, "What will the enemy do, and how can I turn that against them?" Varro never asked that question. He simply looked at the numbers, saw he held the advantage, and drove straight ahead, right to where Hannibal had always wanted him to go. Cannae is not just a story from 2,200 years ago. It is the story of anyone who has ever failed because they trusted too completely in the way they were doing things. There is something very dangerous about prolonged success. It doesn't just make people confident, it makes them believe that their way is the only right way. And when someone or something challenges that belief, the natural response is usually not to question it. It is to pour more resources into the same old path. The Romans did exactly that. They lost twice. And what was their conclusion? We need more troops. No need to change tactics, no need to change thinking, just more troops. Then came the third time. They sent 86,000 men onto the plain of Cannae, an enormous army, full of confidence, full of pride, and Hannibal was already waiting. There is a question that historians are still debating to this very day. If Napoleon had attacked 3 hours earlier on the morning of June 18, 1815, would European history have turned in an entirely different direction? And the answer from most of those who have studied this battle is yes. Just 3 hours. 3 hours was the distance between an empire that continued to exist and an empire that collapsed forever. The remarkable thing is, Napoleon understood that. He knew he didn't have much time left. He knew that every hour passing was another hour the Prussian army drew closer to the battlefield. He knew all of it. He understood all of it. But then he waited anyway. To understand why Waterloo became a catastrophe, you have to understand who Napoleon was at that moment. Not Napoleon at the height of his power, not the emperor who had made all of Europe tremble, but Napoleon in the summer of 1815. He was 45 years old. By 19th century standards, that was not yet old age, but for a man who had lived more than 20 years inside war, who had slept in the saddle more than in a bed, who had commanded campaigns from Egypt to Moscow, 45 years of age for Napoleon was nothing like 45 for an ordinary person. A year before, he had been forced to abdicate, exiled to the island of Elba, a small island off the coast of Italy, and all of Europe finally breathed a long sigh of relief. 20 years of war seemed to be over at last. The old dynasties returned. The old order was restored. Everything seemed to have settled. Then March 1815 happened. Napoleon escaped from Elba. He returned to France with fewer than 1,000 men at his side. King Louis XVIII immediately sent the army to stop him. The moment the two sides came face to face became one of the most famous scenes in European history. Napoleon stepped forward, alone. He opened his coat, then pointed at his own chest and said to the soldiers aiming their rifles at him, "If any of you wishes to shoot your emperor, shoot." No one pulled a trigger. No one moved. Then one by one they lowered their weapons and followed him. In just 3 weeks, Napoleon traveled from the coast to Paris, having spent almost no ammunition at all. Louis XVIII fled, and Napoleon once again took the throne of France. All of Europe reacted immediately. Britain, Prussia, Austria, Russia, and dozens of other nations, all of them understood one thing. If Napoleon was allowed to consolidate his power again, Europe would be plunged back into war for another 20 years. Enormous armies began to be mobilized, advancing from every direction toward France. Napoleon understood his situation clearly. He had no time. He could not wait for all those armies to unite. He had to strike first, strike fast, strike hard, and destroy each opponent before they could coordinate with one another. That was the strategy that had carried him through 20 years, and nearly every time it had worked. The first target was Wellington and the British forces in Belgium. The second was Blücher and the Prussians. If he could defeat both armies before they joined together, Napoleon would have time to turn and deal with Austria and Russia. In theory, it was a brilliant plan. The problem was, a plan on paper and the reality on a battlefield are usually two completely different things. June 16, 1815, Napoleon Bonaparte attacked the Prussians at Ligny and won. Field Marshal Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher was wounded. The Prussian army retreated in disarray. That sounds like a perfect victory, but right there Napoleon made an extremely dangerous mistake. He did not pursue the Prussians aggressively enough, did not grind them down completely, did not finish their fighting capacity. Napoleon believed the Prussians had been knocked out of the fight, that they would vanish from the war for at least a few days. He was wrong. Also on that same day, Marshal Michel Ney attacked the British at Quatre Bras, but he could not land a decisive blow. Arthur Wellington, the Duke of Wellington, held his formation together, held his discipline, and the British withdrew in good order northward to a low ridge near a village called Waterloo. The night of June 17th, the sky opened up. Rain poured down without stopping. It lashed down through the entire night, turning wheat fields into thick, clinging seas of mud. Morning of June 18th, Napoleon woke. He stepped outside and looked at the ground ahead of him. The earth was too wet. His artillery, his greatest source of pride, would not be able to move effectively on soil this saturated. And then Napoleon made a decision. He waited for the ground to dry somewhat, waited a few more hours before opening the battle. Those few hours changed the history of Europe, because while Napoleon was waiting, the Prussian army was marching toward Waterloo. It was not until 11 a.m. that Napoleon ordered the attack, 3 hours later than originally planned. Just 3 hours. But in war, 3 hours can decide an entire empire. Because while Napoleon waited for the ground to dry, the Prussians were coming back. The men he believed had been completely knocked out of the fight. Blücher was severely wounded at that moment. He had to give his orders lying down, but he still told Wellington, "We will come." And they truly were coming to Waterloo. Wellington did not have more men than Napoleon, but he had something more important: time. And he knew how to use every minute of it. He positioned his soldiers on the reverse slope of the ridge, hidden from the French artillery's line of sight. From a distance, the ridge looked nearly empty, but the moment the French began to climb it, everything turned to hell. Rows of British infantry suddenly rose up, firing at close range. Gunsmoke, screaming, men falling on the slope. The entire hillside became a grinding machine. Napoleon attacked relentlessly, wave after wave, but the British held their line. Wellington moved reinforcements constantly. Wherever a section was about to break, he plugged it immediately. He didn't need to win quickly. He only needed to survive until the Prussians appeared. By mid-afternoon, the battle was still undecided. And then Napoleon played his final card: the Imperial Guard, the most elite fighting force in France. Throughout 20 years of war, they had almost never been turned back. For French soldiers, the Imperial Guard was not merely an army, They were the symbol of Napoleon's invincibility. If even the Imperial Guard failed, then perhaps France had truly run out of hope. Around 5,000 Guard soldiers began advancing up the ridge, formation perfect, drums thundering, trumpets echoing across the battlefield. They marched with the confidence of men who had never known what defeat felt like. And then, everything collapsed. Wellington had anticipated that line of attack. He had secretly concealed an infantry brigade behind the tall grass at the crest of the ridge. The moment the Imperial Guard came into view, the British rose together, less than 50 meters away, and they opened fire from 3 sides at once. The Imperial Guard lurched to a halt. Just a few seconds, but on a battlefield, those few seconds are an eternity. They had never faced anything like this before. Then, the thing no one thought would ever happen finally happened. The Imperial Guard began falling back down the slope. And the instant they fell back, the entire French army panicked. The word spread across the battlefield. The Guard is retreating. Napoleon has lost. That was the moment everything changed. Across the battlefield, French soldiers watched the Imperial Guard pulling back. Not destroyed, not routing in chaos, simply falling back. But for men who had fought the entire day, through mud and smoke and blood, that sight carried only one meaning. The battle was already lost. And sometimes belief collapses even faster than cannon fire. The French lines began to break apart, not gradually, but almost simultaneously all along the front. Then, at the worst possible moment, the Prussian army appeared on the right flank of the French. That was the final blow. From his command position, Napoleon Bonaparte watched it all. He tried to use the remaining Imperial Guard units to hold open an orderly retreat, but it was too late. The panic had spread too fast. In less than an hour, Napoleon's army of 72,000 men disintegrated completely. French soldiers began throwing everything away: weapons, coats, packs, anything that slowed them down. And then they ran. His aides almost had to drag Napoleon from the battlefield. That was the last time he ever commanded a battle. People often say Waterloo was Napoleon's failure. But if you look more closely, it was the failure of many things all at once, and not all of it was his fault. First, there was his health. Many historical accounts suggest on June 18, 1815, Napoleon was seriously ill, possibly acute hemorrhoids, possibly a severe digestive problem. Whatever it was, he could barely sit on a horse for any length of time. That mattered enormously because Napoleon was famous for observing the battlefield himself. He would typically ride for hours watching every movement of the enemy with his own eyes, but at Waterloo he stayed at his command post far more than usual, and for the first time in many years he was no longer seeing the whole battle through his own eyes. Second, there was Ney. Marshal Michel Ney, one of the most audacious commanders France had ever produced. In the middle of the afternoon, he spotted several British units moving, and he believed the British were retreating. It was a fatal misreading. Ney immediately launched the entire cavalry in an attack, 5,000 horsemen charging straight up the ridge. But there was a problem: no infantry support, no artillery support, only cavalry charging alone. On the other side, the British had already formed into squares, one of the most formidable defensive formations of that era. Horses would not charge into a wall of bayonets, and cavalry could not break it. The French attacked once, then again. Each charge lost more men, lost more horses, until the attacking strength was exhausted entirely, and Napoleon's finest cavalry vanished into futility. They were the force meant to pursue a fleeing enemy once victory was secured, but they had been consumed far too early. And finally, this is the thing fewest people mention. The Napoleon of 1815 was no longer the Napoleon of 1805, not because he was less intelligent, but because 20 years of unbroken victories had changed everything around him. He had become a living legend. And when a person becomes a legend, very few people any longer dare to tell him he might be wrong. The finest of Napoleon's generals, many had died, many were wounded, many were simply no longer there. Those who remained had grown accustomed to following orders, not arguing, not pushing back. When Ney sent the cavalry in without support, no one stopped him. When Napoleon decided to wait through the morning hours before attacking, no one had the courage to say that might be a mistake. His command structure had grown too dependent on a single person. And on June 18, 1815, that person was no longer at his best. Napoleon was exiled to the island of St. Helena, an island so remote it nearly disappeared into the middle of the Atlantic, far further than Elba, more isolated, more desolate. He lived there for 6 years and died in 2021 at only 51 years old. In his final years, Napoleon read books, walked along the shore, and talked for hours with those who still remained by his side. He recounted every campaign, every battle, every decision that had built his empire. But there was one name that always came back: Waterloo. He returned to it again and again. Napoleon blamed Ney, blamed the rain the night before, blamed the generals who had not followed orders properly, and above all, he spoke of Grouchy, the man given the task of pursuing the Prussians after Ligny. Napoleon believed if Grouchy had done his part correctly, the Prussians could never have reached Waterloo in time, and perhaps European history would have been different. The thing is, those things were not entirely wrong. It's just that they were not the whole truth, because Waterloo was not one man's failure alone, not just because of one wrong order or one night of rain. It was the result of countless small mistakes accumulating until the entire system began to come apart. A command structure that had lost any capacity to correct itself, and at the center of it all was a man who had become too great, so great that no one dared anymore to tell him the things he needed to hear. Waterloo teaches a lesson that many successful people in this world only come to understand after paying a devastating price. Prolonged success doesn't only change a person's capabilities, it changes the people around them. Each victory following the last gradually creates a zone of silence, a place where no one is courageous enough anymore to tell the truth. Not because they can't see the problem, but because they have learned something very dangerous. Speaking up about a problem usually doesn't end well for the person who speaks. Napoleon didn't lose at Waterloo simply because Arthur Wellington, the Duke of Wellington, was a better general than him. Wellington was a superb commander, but even he acknowledged Waterloo was the closest-run battle he had ever experienced. Napoleon lost because on that day he was no longer the best version of himself. And more dangerously still, the system around him had no mechanism left to compensate for that. A good general, at his best, with a team willing to push back, can win. But a great general, at his worst, surrounded by a team that only knows how to obey, will lose. Waterloo is the answer to a deeply unsettling question. What happens when both of those things appear at the same day? Chapter 3. The Fall of France, 1940. Imagine this. You spend 20 years and billions of francs building a wall that cannot be broken. You hire the finest engineers, pour concrete dozens of meters deep into the earth, install artillery, machine guns, underground bunkers, railway tracks running beneath the surface, a ventilation system, hospitals, kitchens, sleeping quarters for tens of thousands of soldiers. That wall stretches along the entire border with Germany, hundreds of kilometers. So formidable that no one believed it could be broken through by a direct assault. At last, the work is finished, and the French look at it with a feeling that is very dangerous: absolute security. Then the enemy doesn't drive straight into the wall. They go around it, and just 46 days later, Paris falls. The most frightening thing about this story is not that France was weak, it's that they trusted too completely in how they had prepared for the war, trusted so deeply that they could no longer see any other possibility. And sometimes, that is what kills an empire. To understand why the French built the Maginot Line, you have to understand what they had survived in the First World War. From 1914 to 1918, France didn't merely participate in the war, it was the battlefield. In the most literal sense, the fighting happened on French soil. Villages were ground into rubble. Fertile fields became seas of mud and craters. Some places could not be farmed again for years after the war ended. And the human cost was so devastating it was nearly impossible to comprehend. 1.4 million French soldiers killed, another 4 million wounded, an entire generation of young men nearly wiped out. In France at that time, almost no family had been left untouched. Those who survived and came home carried bodies that were no longer whole, and memories that would never go away. Then, from those ashes, a question began to haunt all of France. How do we make sure this never happens again? Their answer was to build a wall. The man behind that idea was André Maginot, France's Minister of War, a man who himself had been gravely wounded at Verdun during the First World War. He understood very well the price of having to fight in the open under artillery fire, and he did not want it to happen again. If Germany attacked once more, French soldiers would no longer have to stand in mud as they had in 1914. They would stand behind concrete meters thick, sheltered underground, looking through gun slits and cutting down anyone who tried to cross. Construction began in 1929 and continued through the early 1930s. When it was finished, the Maginot Line had become the largest military construction project and the most expensive the world had ever seen. It ran along France's entire border with Germany and Luxembourg, hundreds of underground fortresses connected by a vast network of tunnels, enough for tens of thousands of soldiers to live, to fight for months at a time without ever needing to come above ground. Technically, it was a masterpiece, but strategically, it was a trap the French had built for themselves. The Maginot Line had one very obvious problem, a problem that even without being a military genius, anyone could spot. It did not cover the entire northern border of France. On the left side of the line, where France bordered Belgium and Luxembourg, there was almost no comparable fortification system. The French had their reasons for that. At the time, Belgium was an ally, and if they were already an ally, why build an enormous wall to defend against them? It sounded perfectly reasonable. But there was a problem. If the Germans attacked through Belgium, exactly as they had done in the First World War, then French troops would be forced to leave the Maginot Line and advance north to meet them. And that was precisely the French command's plan. They believed when war came, French and British forces would quickly move into Belgian territory, block the Germans there, then fight a decisive engagement in the style of the First World War. Meanwhile, the Maginot Line would protect their eastern flank. This plan was not actually foolish. On the contrary, it was entirely reasonable if viewed through the experience of the First World War. That was how the last war had been fought. and the French believed this one would go the same way. But there was one thing they had not grasped. The Germans had no intention of replaying the old war. When the Second World War began in September 1939, Germany swept into Poland. Immediately, the German High Command began thinking about the next objective, France. Their initial plan was fairly familiar. It was called Fall Gelb. In essence, it was just a reworked version of the Schlieffen Plan from the First World War. Strike hard through Belgium and the Netherlands, drive into northern France, then wheel south. A large, frontal, entirely predictable attack. And Erich von Manstein saw that immediately. He didn't think this plan would achieve any surprise. He believed the French were waiting for exactly that. They had prepared for it. They knew the Germans would almost certainly come through Belgium, which meant the strongest Allied and British forces would be concentrated in the north to stop them. Manstein looked at the map and thought in a completely different direction, a direction that almost everyone considered insane. He proposed that the main thrust of the attack should not go through Belgium at all, but through the Ardennes. The Ardennes was a region of dense forest, filled with steep hills, narrow tracks, and a terrain that was extraordinarily difficult to move through. Even on foot, it would take many days. Tanks. Most people considered that impossible. The French thought so. Many German generals thought so too. The roads too narrow, the forest too thick, the terrain too terrible. No one believed an armored force could pass through there quickly enough to mount a major offensive. And it was precisely that which made Manstein want to go through the Ardennes more than ever. He understood something very simple. If the enemy believed that ground was impassable, they would not defend it heavily. They would mass their forces in the north. They would wait for the Germans in Belgium. And if German tanks appeared from the Ardennes faster than anyone had imagined, then all the British and French forces in the north would be cut off from their supply lines, cut off from their retreat routes, trapped in a single blow. But Manstein's superiors didn't like the plan. They rejected it again and again. Too dangerous, too reckless, too likely to turn into disaster. But Manstein didn't give up. He kept proposing it over and over. Then something unexpected happened. The plan eventually reached Hitler. Adolf Hitler read it and was almost immediately convinced. He was drawn to its boldness, drawn to the idea of striking where the enemy felt most secure. And in May 1940, Manstein's plan began to be carried out. May 10th, 1940, Germany attacked. They struck into the Netherlands and Belgium in the north, exactly where the French had predicted. British and French forces immediately advanced into Belgium to respond. Everything was unfolding, at least they thought it was. Meanwhile, to the south, hundreds of German tanks began moving into the forest of the Ardennes, a place that the French command believed no mechanized force could cross quickly enough to pose a real threat. But the Germans went anyway. Not a few small units, the entire main armored thrust. In 3 days, they pushed through the Ardennes and reached the western bank of the Meuse River. German soldiers later recalled that the convoy stretched for hundreds of kilometers. Tanks, trucks, artillery, crawling bumper to bumper through narrow forest tracks. Everything moving slowly, agonizingly, perilously. One well-timed bombing raid on that column and the entire force could have been destroyed. But that didn't happen, and they made it through. The French defensive line at the Meuse was far too thin and almost entirely unprepared for this. May 13th, German tanks crossed the river. May 14th, they drove west at a speed the French command could not believe. Every report coming in said the same thing. The Germans are advancing too fast. So fast that it sounded more like a mistake than the truth. General Erwin Rommel commanded an armored division driving deep into France at a terrifying pace, so fast that even the German High Command began to worry. They ordered Rommel to slow down multiple times. He ignored them, and kept going. In a single day, Rommel's division advanced more than 50 kilometers. At that point in 1940, that was almost beyond imagining. The French command received reports of the breakthrough at the Ardennes, but they could not process the information. Not because they lacked reports, not because they lacked officers, but because what they were hearing didn't match anything they had prepared for, didn't match the doctrine, didn't match the war games, didn't match what they believed was possible. They were not just being defeated on the battlefield, they were being defeated inside their own minds. General Maurice Gamelin, commander-in-chief of the French army, sat at his headquarters outside Paris in a building with no direct communication lines to the front, no proper operations room. While the war was changing by the hour, the brain of the French army was nearly paralyzed, and by the time Gamelin finally understood what was happening, it was already too late. May 20th, just 10 days after the attack began, German tanks reached the English Channel coast. At that moment, everything collapsed. The entire British and French force in Belgium was cut off from the rest of France, trapped, being compressed, and with each passing day, the ring around the port of Dunkirk grew smaller. What happened next is one of the greatest mysteries of the Second World War. May 24, 1940, German tanks were very close to Dunkirk, just a few dozen kilometers away from crushing the entire trapped British and French force. One final blow, a perfect victory. But then Hitler ordered a halt. All German tanks stood still. 2 days, just 2 days. But those 2 days changed history. To this day, people still argue over why Hitler gave that order. Some say he wanted to preserve his tank force for the next campaign in southern France. Another theory holds that Hermann Göring, commander of the German Air Force, persuaded Hitler to let the Luftwaffe finish the battle on its own. And there are historians who believe it was the single greatest strategic blunder of Hitler's entire career. Whatever the real reason was, that fatal pause gave the British what they needed most: time. The British immediately launched Operation Dynamo, a desperate but extraordinary evacuation. From May 26th to June 4th, the beaches of Dunkirk became a scene of desperate chaos. Soldiers packed the shoreline, bombs falling continuously, smoke blanketing the sky. And then anything that could float was pressed into service. Warships, civilian ferries, fishing boats, private pleasure craft. Ordinary citizens steering their vessels into a war zone to bring the soldiers home. When the operation ended, more than 338,000 British and French soldiers had been saved. It was a miracle, but it was also a retreat, because when they left Dunkirk, they had almost nothing left. No tanks, no artillery, no heavy weapons, only the men themselves. Britain kept its army, but lost nearly all the equipment of the expeditionary force on the beaches of Dunkirk. After Dunkirk, everything in France unraveled so quickly it was almost impossible to believe. The Germans immediately turned south. Overwhelming force, terrifying speed. And on the French side, the army that had once been considered the strongest in Europe was now exhausted, its spirit broken, its finest units ground-bound in Belgium. June 10th, the French government left Paris. 4 days later, June 14th, German forces entered the capital. No great battle, no final stand. Paris was left almost without a fight. And then, June 22, 1940, France signed the armistice. From May 10th to June 22nd, just 43 days, one of the greatest military powers in the world brought to its knees in under 2 months. But the most astonishing thing of all was that the Maginot Line remained completely intact. The most expensive defensive construction in French history was never destroyed. Not a single German tank had to assault it head-on. Not 1 meter of concrete was breached. Tens of thousands of French soldiers still stood inside those fortified positions, hands on their weapons, eyes looking through their gun slits toward Germany, waiting for an attack that never came. Then they heard the news that Paris had fallen over the radio. People often say France collapsed because of the Maginot Line, as though the wall itself had betrayed them. But the truth is not that simple. The Maginot Line was not the reason France failed. It was only a symptom of a much larger problem. The French had prepared for a different war from the one they actually had to fight. If you look through the lens of the First World War, every French decision was entirely rational. In 1914, Germany had attacked head-on, so the French built strong fortifications along the border. In 1914, Germany had come through Belgium, so France concentrated its strongest forces in the north. And in 1914, almost no one had thought of driving an entire army through the Ardennes forest, so the French hadn't defended it heavily either. The problem wasn't that those lessons were wrong. On the contrary, they were right, completely right, but only right for 1914. The French mistake was taking the lessons of the old war and applying them to an entirely new one, without ever asking, what if war has changed? What if the enemy doesn't fight the old way? And in truth, they were almost incapable of asking those questions. 20 years after the First World War, the entire French military had been built on the memory of that conflict. The way officers were trained, the way operational plans were drawn up, the way war itself was understood, all of it revolved around preparing for the First World War Part II. They had invested too much money, effort, belief, and the weight of trauma. So much that there was no room left to imagine anything else. Meanwhile, the Germans, the ones who lost the First World War, were in a completely different position. They had no reason to protect the old lessons. They started again from nothing and asked a question that the French had never truly asked. What will the next war look like, rather than how did the last war unfold? The German answer was blitzkrieg, lightning war. Tanks no longer moved slowly to support the infantry. They were concentrated into massive spearheads, punching through defensive lines, racing deep into the rear, cutting communications, cutting supply lines, creating chaos. The objective was no longer to destroy the enemy unit by unit. It was to make the entire system collapse before it could understand what was happening to it. And that is truly what caused France to fail. Not because they were weak, but because they were still preparing for yesterday's war, while the Germans had already stepped into tomorrow's. The story of France in 1940 is not a story about cowardice, nor about French soldiers lacking courage. Throughout those 46 days, they still fought, and still died on the battlefield. What caused France to collapse was something else. It was what happens when an organization bets too heavily on one way of doing things until it loses the ability to adapt. The Maginot Line was not just concrete, not just fortresses. It was the symbol of a rigid way of thinking. When you pour into a solution too much money, too much time, too much reputation, then at some point, that solution is no longer a tool. It becomes a belief, and that is the most dangerous moment of all. Because when reality changes, you no longer have the capacity to change with it. Too much has been locked into the old way, and your enemy, if they are smart enough, will not charge at where you are strongest. They will find the place you have left unguarded, the place where you believe no one could come through. The Germans didn't destroy the Maginot Line, they simply went around it, moving through the Ardennes forest, the place where the French had believed tanks could not advance. And on the strength of one false assumption, the history of Europe was turned in a different direction forever. Because in the end, victory belongs to the army willing to ask questions, while defeat belongs to the army that believes it already has all the answers. Chapter 4: The Battle of Midway, 1942. In June 1942, Japan had the most powerful navy in Asia. They had more aircraft carriers, more planes, more experienced pilots, men who had logged hundreds of hours of actual combat flying from China to the Pacific. They had Admiral Yosoroku Yamamoto, widely regarded as the finest naval strategist in the world at that time. And they had a detailed plan, carefully prepared over many months to completely destroy what remained of the American Navy in the Pacific. The Americans had 3 aircraft carriers, less experienced pilots, and a fleet still trying to recover from the disaster at Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. On paper, this was not an equal contest. Japan was nearly certain to win. But there was one thing Yamamoto didn't know, and that thing changed the entire war in the space of 5 minutes. To understand why Midway mattered so much, you need to know where Japan stood in the summer of 1942. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, in a surprise airstrike that sank or damaged 8 American battleships, destroyed nearly 200 aircraft, and killed more than 2,400 people. It was the most humiliating day in American naval history. In the 6 months that followed, Japan dominated the Pacific. They seized the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, Indonesia, Burma, and dozens of smaller islands scattered across the Pacific. The speed and scale of those conquests surprised even the Japanese themselves. But Yamamoto understood something many of his colleagues were unwilling to admit. Japan could not win a prolonged war against the United States. The Japanese economy was too small, its resources too limited, its defense industry too weak compared to America's enormous industrial capacity. If the war dragged on long enough, the Americans would build more ships, train more pilots, and eventually grind Japan down through sheer material weight. So Yamamoto had a strategy: end the war before America could mobilize its full strength. The only way to do that was to destroy the American carrier fleet in a single decisive battle, leave the Americans incapable of fighting in the Pacific, and force Washington to negotiate a peace favorable to Japan. Midway, a tiny coral atoll sitting in the middle of the Pacific, roughly 1,800 kilometers northwest of Hawaii, was the bait Yamamoto chose. If Japan attacked Midway, the American carrier fleet would have to come out and respond, and when they did, Yamamoto would be waiting with overwhelming force. That was the plan, and it was nearly perfect. The room in the basement. At the American Naval Headquarters in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, there was a room that appeared on no official diagram. People called it Station Hypo. Inside that room, a team of cryptanalysts led by Commander Joseph Rochefort had spent months trying to crack the Japanese Navy's communication cipher known as JN-25. JN-25 was complex and changed frequently. Breaking it was not the work of an afternoon, but Rochefort and his team had been doing it for months, piece by piece, intercepted telegram by intercepted telegram, working from the recurring patterns they gradually came to recognize. By the spring of 1942, they could read a significant portion of Japanese naval signals. Not all of them, not with complete clarity, but enough to recognize that Japan was planning a major operation targeting a location coded in the telegrams as AF. The problem was, they didn't know where AF was. Rochefort believed AF was Midway. Intelligence officers in Washington disagreed. They thought AF could be the West Coast, or Alaska, or anywhere else. Rochefort needed concrete proof, and he devised a way to get it. He sent word to the Midway base, asking them to broadcast an unencrypted message, in plain language, reporting that the base was experiencing a problem with its water filtration system. A few days later, an intercepted Japanese signal was decoded. It reported that AF was having problems with its water filtration system and might be running short of fresh water. AF was Midway. Rochefort had been right. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the American Pacific Fleet, received that information and made one of the boldest decisions in American naval history. He knew Japan was coming. He knew they were stronger than him. He knew Yamamoto was trying to lure him out and destroy him. But rather than avoid the trap, he decided to turn that trap into one of his own. He called all 3 remaining American carriers back to Pearl Harbor. The Yorktown had been heavily damaged in the Battle of the Coral Sea only weeks earlier, with a repair estimate of 3 months. Nimitz ordered the work done in 3 days. The repair crews worked around the clock, and 3 days later Yorktown put to sea, not fully healed, but fit enough to fight. Nimitz positioned all 3 carriers and their escorts northeast of Midway, outside the range of Japanese reconnaissance. He waited there in silence, emitting no radio signals, giving away no position. Yamamoto didn't know the American fleet was there. He believed the Americans would not be able to assemble sufficient force in time and would only respond after Japan had already struck Midway. He was wrong on every count. Before dawn on June 4, 1942, Japan launched the first wave of aircraft from 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, to strike the Midway base. The attack damaged the base but did not destroy it. The Japanese air commander reported that a second strike would be needed to finish the job. That was the first moment things began to go wrong for Yamamoto. The aircraft waiting on the Japanese carrier decks at that point were armed with torpedoes, ready to attack enemy warships if they appeared. But the fleet's air commander, Vice Admiral Nagumo, decided to rearm them, swapping the torpedoes for bombs to carry out the second strike on Midway. It was a reasonable decision based on the information he had at that moment. He had no indication that American carriers were nearby. Rearming took time. Bombs and torpedoes were hauled up from the storage magazines below deck and left sitting on the open flight decks while the ground crews worked. At precisely that moment, a Japanese reconnaissance plane reported spotting American warships. Nagumo paused. Then the plane reported further. Among those warships was a carrier. Nagumo immediately ordered the process reversed, swapped the bombs back for torpedoes to attack the carrier. But that reversal needed more time, and during that time the flight decks of all 4 Japanese carriers were laden with bombs, torpedoes, and fueled aircraft. That was what was waiting when American dive bombers appeared out of the clouds above. American pilots had made multiple attacks on the Japanese fleet throughout that morning, and almost all of them had failed catastrophically. The Devastator torpedo planes, slow, outdated aircraft, flew straight into dense defensive fire and were cut down nearly to a man. Of the 3 American torpedo squadrons that attacked that morning, 41 planes in total, only 6 returned. Not a single torpedo found its mark. But those failed attacks had pulled all the Japanese fighter cover down to low altitude to intercept them, leaving the sky above the fleet completely unguarded. And at 6,000 meters, unseen by anyone, 3 squadrons of American dauntless dive bombers were searching for their targets. At 10:22 in the morning, Squadron Commander Wade McCluskey looked down and spotted the wake of a Japanese destroyer moving at speed, clearly headed toward the main fleet. He followed that heading and found all 4 Japanese carriers spread out below him, their flight decks loaded with aircraft, bombs, and fuel. He ordered the attack. In the 5 minutes that followed, 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, caught fire. Not because American bombs were especially powerful, but because when bombs struck flight decks already loaded with fuel and ammunition, everything else detonated in turn. The fire spread down through the lower decks, setting off the magazines, and the 3 ships sank into the ocean over the hours that followed. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, survived long enough to launch aircraft that struck the Yorktown and inflicted serious damage. But by that afternoon, American planes found the Hiryu and sank her too. In a single day, Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers, more than 250 aircraft, and more than 3,000 men. More important than all of that, they lost more than 100 irreplaceable veteran pilots, men who had taken years to train and whom Japan would never have enough time to replace. America lost 1 carrier, the Yorktown, 150 aircraft, and around 300 men. The balance of power in the Pacific shifted permanently in those 5 minutes. People often say Japan lost at Midway because of luck, because the timing of the American attack happened to coincide with the moment the Japanese decks were being rearmed, because McCluskey happened to spot a destroyer's wake at just the right instant. Luck played its part, it always does in war, but calling Midway luck overlooks what mattered more. The first was security. Japan had allowed its JN-25 cipher to be broken without knowing it. They had no process for periodically checking whether their codes were still secure. Some Japanese intelligence officers had actually suspected their cipher might have been compromised, but those warnings were dismissed. Had Japan known the Americans were reading their signals, the entire Midway operation would never have unfolded as it did. The second was the excessive complexity of the plan. Yamamoto divided his fleet into multiple separate groups, dispersed across a vast stretch of ocean, each with different objectives and missions. The plan rested on the assumption that everything would unfold exactly as anticipated, and that the groups would coordinate flawlessly. In reality, the more steps a plan contains, the more things can go wrong. And when one thing goes wrong, the rest of the plan begins to come apart. The third was Nagumo's dilemma that morning. The decision to rearm and then rearm again was not a stupid one. It was the reasonable decision of a man receiving contradictory information with insufficient time to process it. But that decision was what left the carrier decks covered in bombs and fuel at the moment the American planes arrived. And the fourth, the least mentioned of all, was the invisible arrogance built into the entire plan. Yamamoto designed Midway as a trap to lure the American carriers out. That plan quietly assumed the Americans would not know the trap was being set, that they would react more slowly, that American intelligence would be less effective. All of those assumptions were wrong. Yamamoto was a strategic genius, but he designed his plan around the image of an opponent he wanted to believe in, rather than the opponent actually standing in front of him. Midway did not end the war. There were more than 3 more years of fighting before Japan surrendered in August 1945. But after Midway, the nature of the war changed entirely. Before Midway, Japan was on the offensive and America was defending. After Midway, that reversed. Japan never regained the initiative in the Pacific. They never managed to replace the pilots they had lost. In that same time, America built dozens more carriers and trained thousands of new pilots, exactly what Yamamoto had feared would happen if the war went on too long. Yamamoto himself was shot down in April 1943 when his plane was ambushed by American fighter aircraft during an inspection tour of the front. The Americans knew where he would be flying because they had decoded the signal announcing his itinerary. Even at the end, intelligence was what killed him. Midway is the clearest and most painful lesson in the importance of information. Not information in some general sense, but the right kind of information correctly understood and, most critically, reaching the people who need it before it is too late. Yamamoto did not lose for lack of courage or lack of talent. He lost because he didn't know his opponent was reading every signal he sent. Every advantage in numbers, in experience, in tactics became meaningless once the thing that mattered most had already been lost before the battle even began. But there is a second lesson Midway left behind, less obvious than the first. Rochefort and his team at Station Hypo were not the people with the most powerful weapons or the highest rank. They were the people sitting in a basement, working with ciphers and intercepted telegrams, doubted by Washington and sometimes openly dismissed. They had no tanks, no warships, no aircraft. But they had something more important than all of those things on June 4, 1942. And 3 Japanese aircraft carriers sank to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean to prove it. Chapter 5. The Bay of Pigs, 1961. In April 1961, President John F. Kennedy sat in the Oval Office and approved a plan he didn't fully believe in, designed by an agency he didn't fully understand, to carry out a mission built on assumptions no one had ever verified. 72 hours later, that plan collapsed completely. 1,200 men were captured. Hundreds were dead, and the United States, the most powerful nation on Earth, quietly paid $53 million in food and medicine as ransom to get those men back. Kennedy would later call this the most humiliating failure of his career, not because of its scale, but because of how it happened. Because no one in that room, not one among the finest minds in the American government, had asked the right questions before everything began. To understand the Bay of Pigs, you need to understand what Fidel Castro represented to Washington in 1961. In January 1959, Castro overthrew the Batista dictatorship and took power in Cuba. At first, Washington wasn't overly concerned. Cuba was just a small island 145 kilometers off the Florida coast. Castro hadn't declared himself a communist, and America had coexisted with plenty of difficult governments in Latin America without serious problems. But then Castro began nationalizing American companies in Cuba. He seized agricultural land from large landowners, many of them American citizens or closely tied to American interests. He signed a trade agreement with the Soviet Union, and he spoke in a tone Washington had never heard from any Latin American leader before: direct, defiant, and unafraid. This was 1960, at the height of the Cold War. The Soviets had just launched Sputnik. China had just gone communist, and now a pro-Soviet government was taking shape less than 200 kilometers from American shores. For Eisenhower and the entire American national security apparatus, that was intolerable. The CIA was given the task of dealing with the Cuba problem. From 1960 onward, the CIA began recruiting and training Cuban exiles, men who had left Cuba after Castro came to power and wanted to bring him down. Most were former soldiers, former officials, or landowners who had lost their property after nationalization. They had motivation. They hated Castro, and the CIA had money, weapons, and a plan. That plan was developed under Eisenhower, but Kennedy was the one who had to decide whether to carry it out. When Kennedy took office in January 1961, he was briefed on the Cuba operation. He was a new president, 43 years old, without much military and diplomatic experience at the highest level. Around him sat men considered the elite of American policy, men with degrees from Harvard and Yale, with decades of experience in government and intelligence. The CIA presented the plan with the confidence of an organization that had already toppled governments in Iran in 1953 and Guatemala in 1954 without anyone finding out. They had done it before. They knew how it was done. Cuba would be no different. The plan sounded reasonable on paper. Around 1,400 trained Cuban exiles would land on the Cuban coast. A secret airstrike beforehand would destroy Castro's air force on the ground. Once the landing force came ashore and began moving inland, Cuban citizens, already discontented with Castro's regime, would rise up in support. The Castro government would collapse from within before it could mount a counterattack. That was the plan, and every step of it rested on an assumption no one had verified. Kennedy was uneasy about the plan from the beginning, but he was in a very difficult position. If he refused, the CIA and the military would see him as weak. This was 1961, the middle of the Cold War, when any sign of hesitation in the face of communist expansion was read as weakness. And Kennedy had just taken office, needing to prove himself to both diplomatic adversaries and skeptical colleagues at home. If he approved it, he was betting on a plan with far too many variables he couldn't control. He chose to approve it, but with one condition. He scaled back the initial airstrike. Instead of destroying the entire Cuban Air Force on the ground as the original plan called for, he authorized a smaller strike, fewer aircraft to reduce the footprint and the obviousness of American involvement. It was a decision that tried to split the difference between action and deniability, and in practice, it destroyed both. The smaller strike wasn't sufficient to eliminate the Cuban Air Force. A significant portion of Castro's aircraft remained intact on the ground. And rather than reducing the American fingerprint, it only made the failure more visible once everything fell apart. But none of that was the biggest problem. The biggest problem was that the entire plan had been leaked before it even started. What the CIA called a covert operation was not actually secret to anyone who genuinely wanted to know. The training camps for the Cuban exile force were located in Guatemala. Local people watched them train every day. The Guatemalan press reported on the existence of the camps. The New York Times ran a story about the operation being prepared. Radio Havana, Cuba's state broadcaster, continuously aired announcements that America was preparing an invasion and called on citizens to prepare for resistance. Castro didn't just know an attack was coming, he knew nearly every detail of the plan. In the weeks before the landing, he had arrested thousands of suspected CIA collaborators across the island. The underground network the CIA expected to support the landing force from within had been almost entirely dismantled before the operation began. And the most critical assumption of the entire plan, that the Cuban people would rise up in support when the landing force came ashore, was also completely wrong. The CIA had assessed the level of Cuban popular discontent with Castro largely on the basis of information from Cuban exiles in Miami. Those people hated Castro. They wanted to believe that everyone in Cuba hated Castro as much as they did. And the CIA, rather than independently verifying whether that was actually true, accepted it as fact. But Cuba in 1961 was not the Cuba those exiles remembered. Many of Castro's programs, land reform, literacy campaigns, free medical care, had genuinely won the support of a significant portion of the Cuban population, particularly the poor who had received nothing under Batista. When the landing force came ashore, there was no uprising. The Cuban people did not welcome them as liberators. Many of them ran to alert Castro's forces. Before dawn on April 17, 1961, around 1,400 Cuban exiles landed on the coast of the Bay of Pigs in southern Cuba. From the very first hours, everything went wrong. The landing site had been chosen largely because of its remoteness to reduce the risk of detection, but that same remoteness also meant no local support network, no fallback escape route, and no way to resupply if the landing force became pinned down. Underwater coral reefs that CIA maps hadn't fully charted damaged many of the landing craft. Communications equipment got wet and failed. Navigation beacons didn't work properly. And the Cuban Air Force, the aircraft the limited American strike had failed to destroy, appeared on that first morning and began attacking both the landing force and the supply ships offshore. 2 ships carrying reserve ammunition and weapons were sunk. That was the entire reserve stockpile for the landing force sitting on the ocean floor by the end of the first day. Kennedy, sitting in Washington tracking hourly reports, faced a choice with no good answer. He could order the American Navy and Air Force to intervene openly to save the landing force, turning this into an open war between the United States and Cuba, or he could hold to the position of deniability, refuse to intervene directly, and watch the landing force be destroyed. He chose not to intervene directly. 3 days after the landing, the Cuban exile force surrendered. They had fought to their last bullet, in the literal sense, because all their reserve ammunition was at the bottom of the sea. 1,197 men were taken prisoner. The rest were dead or missing. Kennedy later said something that has been quoted ever since. He said he couldn't understand how he had ever approved such a foolish plan. That is truly the question worth asking, because the people in that conference room were not foolish or inexperienced. They were the most intelligent, best trained, and best informed people in the American government. So why did no one ask the most basic question? Are these assumptions actually correct? Arthur Schlesinger, the historian and Kennedy advisor, later described those meetings using a word that has since become a term taught in every management school in the world. He called it groupthink. Groupthink is what happens when a group of intelligent people, sitting together long enough in a sufficiently agreeable environment, begin adjusting their thinking to fit the group rather than to fit reality. No one announces this consciously. No one in the room decides to stop thinking critically. It happens gradually, meeting by meeting, as people come to recognize that expressing doubt makes them look weak, indecisive, or not quite one of the team. Schlesinger himself had serious misgivings about the plan beforehand. He didn't voice them in the meeting because he didn't want to be the only person raising his hand in objection while all the more senior, more experienced figures around him were nodding along. He wrote about this afterward with evident regret. That was not Schlesinger's story alone. It was the story of many people in the room that day. One person stayed silent because someone else had already agreed. That someone else had agreed because a third person hadn't objected. And so it went, until a room full of people with genuine doubts had produced a consensus that was entirely artificial. The Bay of Pigs was not only a military failure. Its geopolitical consequences were deeper and longer lasting by far. Before the Bay of Pigs, Castro had not fully bound Cuba to the Soviet Union. He was searching for a more neutral, more independent position in the Cold War. But when the United States tried to overthrow him by funding a covert invasion, he had no remaining options. He officially declared Cuba a communist state. He sought Soviet protection. And the Soviet Union, seeing the opportunity to place weapons 145 kilometers from the Florida coast, was ready to oblige. 18 months after the Bay of Pigs, the world stood on the edge of nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962, when the Soviets were installing nuclear missiles in Cuba and Kennedy faced choices that could have ended human civilization. People don't often connect these two events, but the thread running from the room where Kennedy approved the Bay of Pigs plan to the room where he confronted the missile crisis is direct and unmistakable. The Bay of Pigs didn't create the Cuban Missile Crisis, but it created the conditions that made that crisis possible. What is notable about Kennedy is not that he made a mistake. What is notable is how he responded to it. He stood before the nation and accepted full responsibility. He didn't blame the CIA, didn't blame the advisors who had drawn up the plan, didn't look for a way around it. He said plainly that this was the government's failure, and he was the head of the government. Behind closed doors, he did something more important. He changed how his conference room operated. During the Cuban Missile Crisis a year later, Kennedy consciously designed his meetings differently. He would often leave the room early so that his advisors could argue more freely without being influenced by the president's presence. He asked people to challenge each other's positions. He created space for disagreement. That is why many scholars of leadership believe Kennedy handled the Cuban Missile Crisis far better than the Bay of Pigs, even though the pressure during the missile crisis was many times greater. The lesson he learned from the Bay of Pigs saved the world from nuclear war 18 months later. The Bay of Pigs teaches a lesson that anyone who has ever sat in a conference room will recognize even if they've never had a name for it. When status, pressure, and the desire to belong to the group are strong enough, the most intelligent people in the room will stop asking questions. Not because they can't see the problem, but because the social cost of speaking up is far higher than the cost of staying quiet. That is why groupthink is more dangerous than stupidity. Stupidity can be spotted. Groupthink hides inside consensus, wearing the clothes of professionalism and decisiveness, and only reveals itself once everything has already fallen apart. Kennedy spent 72 hours learning that lesson in the most costly way possible, but at least he learned it. And the question for you is not whether you have ever sat in a room like that. The question is whether you would recognize it while it was happening, and when you did, whether you would have the courage to be the one who raised their hand.
Chapter 6: The Soviet Union in Afghanistan, 1979 to 1989. In December 1979, the Soviet Union sent forces into Afghanistan with a simple plan: stabilize the situation, support the faltering pro-Soviet government, then withdraw within a few months once everything had been put back in order. 10 years later, in 1989, the last Soviet soldiers crossed the Friendship Bridge back into Uzbekistan. General Boris Grumov, commanding the withdrawal, walked across that bridge alone, turned to look back toward Afghanistan, then told the waiting reporters that behind him there was not a single Soviet soldier left on Afghan soil. That was the moment that ended 10 years of what people would later call the unwinnable war. But the thing truly worth noting is not that the Soviet Union lost. The thing worth noting is why they didn't recognize they were losing until it was too late to do anything other than leave. And more worth noting still, they were not the first empire to learn that lesson in Afghanistan, nor the last. Before speaking of the Soviets, it is worth speaking of the ground they stepped onto. Afghanistan is not a nation in the sense familiar to Westerners. It is a collection of dozens of tribes, clans, and ethnic groups, each with their own history, language, and loyalties. Those groups had been fighting one another for centuries, but when an outsider arrived, they could set every internal grievance aside and fight that outsider with a unity and tenacity no invading army had ever found a way to overcome. The British learned that lesson 3 times in the 19th and early 20th centuries. In 1842, a British column of 16,000 men retreated from Kabul and was attacked continuously throughout the march. Only one man survived to tell the story. The British returned, struck back, and withdrew a second time in 1880, then again a third time after the First World War. Each time they came with overwhelming military superiority. Each time they left without achieving any lasting objective. The Soviets knew that history. They had studied the British campaigns in Afghanistan as part of their military training curriculum. They knew, and they went in anyway. To understand Moscow's decision in 1979, you need to understand how the Soviet Union was reading the world at that moment. Afghanistan had been in the hands of the People's Democratic Party since 1978, a pro-Soviet communist party that had seized power through a coup. but that party was tearing itself apart from within. One leader assassinated the next, one faction purged another, and meanwhile, Islamic resistance groups were rising up across the country, reacting against the forced reforms a new government was imposing on a society that was deeply conservative and traditional. Moscow looked at that situation and saw an allied government on the verge of collapse. If Afghanistan fell to Islamic forces, that was not merely losing an ally, it was a threat that could spread to the Muslim republics along the Soviet Union's southern edge, where tens of millions of Muslims were living under Moscow. In December 1979, the KGB assassinated Afghan Communist Party General Secretary Hafiz Allah Amin, a man Moscow didn't trust, and replaced him with Babrak Karmal, someone they could control more easily. At the same time, Soviet forces began moving in. In the diaries of those who made that decision in Moscow, it is recorded that they expected to complete the mission and withdraw within 6 months to a year. In the opening weeks, everything went according to plan. Soviet forces occupied Kabul and the major cities quickly and easily. The Karmal government was installed, the local resistance units known as the Mujahideen dispersed before the overwhelming military power of the Red Army and withdrew into the remote mountain regions. For Moscow, everything appeared to be moving in the right direction. But the Mujahideen retreating into the mountains were not running away, they were going home. The Hindu Kush Range, with peaks above 7,000 meters, deep plunging valleys, and a complex network of caves stretching for hundreds of kilometers, was not unfamiliar terrain to the men fighting there. This was where they were born, where they grew up, where they knew every mountain path, every rock crevice, every village. To them, those mountains were not an obstacle, they were the finest natural fortress in the world. And the Red Army, trained to fight on European plains against NATO tanks, entered those mountains without any proportionate preparation.
In conventional warfare, there are front lines, there are defensive positions, there is controlled territory and enemy territory. You look at a map and know where you are and where the enemy is. Afghanistan had none of that. The Mujahideen didn't capture territory and hold it. They attacked and vanished. They ambushed a supply convoy, then melted into the forest before Soviet helicopters could arrive. They planted mines on a road that Soviet forces had passed safely the day before. They struck a small outpost at night, and there was no one to find when dawn came. Soviet forces controlled the cities. They controlled the main roads during daylight. But the countryside, the valleys, and the mountain tracks belonged to the Mujahideen at night, and often during the day as well. That created a cycle with no exit. To protect the supply lines, the Soviets needed to post garrisons along those roads. Each garrison needed troops to man it. Each small, isolated unit was an easy target for attack. When a garrison was attacked, it needed reinforcement. Reinforcements moved by road and became targets for ambush. To counter the ambushes, more patrols were needed. More patrols meant more soldiers exposed in the open, and the cycle continued. A force of 100,000 Soviet troops, a colossal number by the standards of conventional war, dissolved into the Afghan landscape like salt into water. In the early years, the Soviet Union had one decisive advantage: helicopters. The Soviet Mi-24 Hind attack helicopter, nicknamed the Flying Devil by the Americans, was the dominant weapon in Afghan airspace. It could fly across terrain tanks couldn't reach, spot Mujahideen on the move, and destroy them from above before they could find cover. It struck villages the Soviets suspected of sheltering Mujahideen. It provided close air support to infantry units under attack. It became the symbol of Soviet military power in Afghanistan. The Mujahideen feared it, and they had nothing to use against it. By 1986, that changed. The CIA had been secretly funding and arming the Mujahideen through Pakistan and Saudi Arabia since the war began. rifles, ammunition, money. But in 1986, the Reagan administration decided to escalate. They began supplying Stinger shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles capable of shooting down low-flying aircraft and helicopters. The first time the Mujahideen brought down a Hind with a Stinger in September 1986, the story of the war began to shift. Not because losing one helicopter was a military catastrophe, but because word spread rapidly through the valleys of Afghanistan that the weapon everyone had believed untouchable could now be touched. Mujahideen morale soared, and Soviet pilots who previously flew low with confidence knowing there was no threat from below began flying higher, reducing their accuracy and effectiveness. That year, the Soviet Union lost 270 aircraft and helicopters. The figure climbed significantly in the years that followed. The air superiority that was the only thing giving the Soviets an edge in Afghan terrain had begun to erode. But the Stinger missiles were not the only reason the Soviets lost, not even the primary one. The primary reason was what was happening in the villages. The Soviet strategy, designed for conventional warfare, rested on the principle that if you control enough territory and destroy enough enemy forces, the opponent loses the capacity to fight and surrenders. But that principle doesn't apply when the enemy is not an army that can be destroyed, but a movement rooted in the very people living on that land. Every village Soviet forces burned because they suspected it sheltered Mujahideen pushed more families into the ranks of the resistance. Every man killed in a mistaken strike left sons and brothers with a reason, specific, personal, and impossible to erase, to keep fighting. Every arbitrary arrest, every affront to religious belief, every small painful episode accumulated into a tide of hatred that never ran dry. The Soviet Union could not win that war militarily because it was not a purely military war. It was a war of will, of identity, and of a people defending what they held most sacred. And in that kind of war, the side with more tanks is not necessarily the side that wins. 10 years of war left figures that are difficult to read without pausing. 15,000 Soviet soldiers died. Tens of thousands more were wounded or fell ill. Hundreds of tanks, aircraft, and helicopters were destroyed. On the Afghan side, estimates suggest between 1 and 2 million civilians were killed in those 10 years. Not soldiers, civilians, farmers, women, children, who died in bombing campaigns, attacks on villages, and the famines that war brought in its wake. Another 5 million or so became refugees, leaving Afghanistan to Pakistan and Iran to live in camps with no foreseeable end. Afghan agricultural land was so heavily mined that large regions could not be farmed for decades afterward. Infrastructure was destroyed. Irrigation systems, buildings, schools, things built over generations were reduced to rubble. And above all those numbers was a consequence that no one in the Soviet Politburo of 1979 could have imagined when they signed the order to send forces in.
In 1979, the Soviet Union was a superpower. The economy was struggling, but still strong enough to sustain a massive military machine. The political system was calcifying, but still standing. But Afghanistan was not a cost the Soviet Union could absorb without consequence. Each year of war in Afghanistan consumed $2 to $3 billion in an economy growing increasingly exhausted by military spending and the inefficiency of central planning. Oil prices, the Soviet Union's main source of foreign currency, fell sharply in the first half of the 1980s. Just when the Soviets needed money most, their revenue was being significantly cut. Afghanistan did not bring down the Soviet Union on its own, but it accelerated a process in which the system was already weakening from within. It drained resources, it depleted morale,
It produced a generation of traumatized veterans returning from a war no one could clearly explain why they had fought. And when Gorbachev came to power in 1985 and began the policies of glasnost and perestroika, one of the first things he did was decide to withdraw from Afghanistan. He called the war a bleeding wound. 3 years after the Soviet Union left Afghanistan, the Soviet Union no longer existed. What makes the Afghanistan story more than just the Soviet Union story is the pattern it shares with too many other military interventions across history. The British learned that lesson in Afghanistan in the 19th century, the Soviets learned it in the 1980s, and the Americans, after September 11, 2001, entered Afghanistan with the most modern military in history, with a defense budget larger than the rest of the world combined, and stayed for 20 years. In 2021, the last American soldier left Afghanistan. The government that America had spent 20 years and trillions of dollars building collapsed in under 2 weeks after the troops withdrew. 3 empires, 3 different centuries, 3 times learning the same lesson in the same painful way. That lesson is not that military power has no value. Military power can win battles, seize territory, and destroy enemy forces. But military power cannot impose a political and social order on a people who do not want it, cannot buy genuine loyalty with money or guns, cannot replace a political foundation with internal legitimacy with one imported from outside. That is the thing the British in the 19th century, the Soviets in the 1980s, and the Americans in the 2000s all refused to hear when they walked in. The story of the Soviet Union in Afghanistan is not only a story about war and geopolitics. It is the story of an enormous, powerful organization, fully confident in its own strength, stepping into a situation where that strength was not the answer to the problem that actually existed. The Soviet Union didn't lose because they lacked tanks or soldiers. They lost because they looked at Afghanistan and saw a space to be controlled, while what was actually there was a people with a history, an identity, and a will that no army could grind down with bombs and bullets. And they lost because no one in the Soviet Politburo had the courage to stand up and say plainly that 10 years after walking in, they still had no answer to the most basic question. What are we trying to achieve, and can it actually be achieved this way? That question was not asked in 1979, and the price of not asking it was 10 years, 15,000 lives, millions of refugees, and an empire already on its way to collapse. Chapter 7. The Charge of the Light Brigade, 1854. There are moments in history when people do something completely wrong, but do it so beautifully that those who come after don't know whether to weep or to marvel. October 25th, 1854 was one such moment. 655 British cavalry formed into perfect order, lances upright, sabers gleaming in the Crimean autumn sun. Then they began to ride, not wheeling to either side, not pulling back, but driving straight into the mouth of the Russian guns. At the far end of the narrow valley, more than a kilometer away, 50 artillery pieces were waiting. Cannonballs began screaming through the air, from the left, from the right, and from straight ahead. Horses went down. Men were thrown from their saddles, steel clashing, voices crying out through the smoke. But the formation kept driving forward. No one turned back. No one broke ranks. They rode as though parading through the streets of London, not charging into death. On a distant ridge, French troops stood in silence, looking down into the valley. General Pierre Bosquet, A man who had seen too much war in his life could only utter a single line. "It is magnificent, but it is not war." And perhaps he was right on both counts. To understand why those 655 men rode straight into death, you have to understand what they were doing in Crimea in the first place. The year was 1853. Russia and Ottomans went to war, fighting for control of the Black Sea and influence in the Balkans. Then Britain and France joined in, not because they particularly loved the Ottomans, but because they feared something else more. They feared Russia growing too powerful in Eastern Europe. And so Crimea became the place every great power brought its own interests. Too much political calculation, too much ego, too many officers wanting to prove themselves, but far too few people actually working together. From the very beginning, this war was a mess. The British Supreme Commander was Lord Raglan, a courteous aristocrat, 65 years old, who had lost an arm at Waterloo 40 years earlier, and after that battle he had almost never seen direct combat again. Raglan was not a bad man. He was kind, decent, the sort of person soldiers could respect. But modern warfare does not care whether a person is courteous. It needs someone who can manage chaos, and Raglan was not that kind of person. Below him, the situation was even worse. There were 2 cavalry generals, and the frightening thing was the depth of their hatred for each other sometimes exceeded even their hatred for the Russians. The first was Lord Lucan, commander of the entire cavalry division, rigid, arrogant, and famous for interpreting orders in whichever way best served himself. The other was Lord Cardigan, commander of the Light Brigade, and in bitter irony, he happened to be Lucan's brother-in-law. These 2 men despised each other to the point where they had almost stopped speaking directly to one another, despite commanding the same operation. Think about that. An army preparing to go to war, and the men at the top can barely stand to look at each other. That was the British command structure in Crimea, and just a few days later, that disorder would kill hundreds of people. The Battle of Balaclava began early. The mist was still lying over the valley when Russian forces struck at Ottoman defensive positions on the surrounding hills. The Ottomans were quickly driven back. A handful of artillery pieces were left behind, and then the Russians began dragging them away. From higher ground, Lord Raglan watched it all. He stood on the hilltop where the entire battlefield was spread before him as clearly as an open map. He could see the Russians taking those guns, and in his mind, that was something that could not be permitted. Raglan immediately wrote an order, then handed it to a young officer named Nolan to carry down into the valley. The order was very brief: cavalry to advance and take advantage of every opportunity to recover the heights. From Raglan's position, that sentence was perfectly clear. He was referring to the Ottoman artillery on the hillside, the guns the Russians were dragging away right in front of him. He could see them plainly. But Lucan could not. He was standing at the bottom of the valley. From down there, the hills were almost entirely obscured from view. The only thing Lucan could see ahead of him was the far end of the valley, and there the Russians had established a massive artillery position, dozens of cannon, all of them pointing directly at him. Lucan read the order, then turned to Nolan. "Where exactly are we to advance?" Nolan was extremely irritated at that moment, frustrated by the long ride down, frustrated by what he saw as the British cavalry's sluggishness throughout the whole campaign. And then he raised his arm and pointed forward, a very brief gesture, but also one of the most consequential gestures in military history. because for years afterward, people would argue about where Nolan was actually trying to point. Lucan understood it in only one way: attack straight at the artillery position at the end of the valley. He passed the order down to Cardigan. Cardigan looked ahead. He could see the Russian guns waiting, could see the long, empty stretch of open ground. No trees, no cover, nowhere to hide. He understood immediately. This was suicide. But Cardigan was a British officer. He'd been trained to obey orders, without argument, without hesitation, and above all, he would never let Lucan see him show fear. Cardigan slowly turned, looked at the cavalry behind him, then lowered his saber, and they began to ride. Nolan rode forward alongside the cavalry, and just minutes later he was dead. A shell fragment tore straight into his chest. No one would ever know what he was trying to say in those final seconds, whether he had realized the mistake, whether he was waving his arm trying to call a halt. No one would ever know. Then the Russian artillery opened fire, from the end of the valley, then from the hillside on the right, then the left as well. Cannonballs cut through the cavalry formation from 3 directions at once. Horses collapsed, men were thrown from their saddles. Gaps opened in the ranks, then immediately closed again as the men behind kept riding forward to fill them. But they did not stop, did not veer aside, did not panic. They drove straight ahead, the formation holding its discipline as though this were merely a drill on a parade ground back home. On a distant ridge, William Howard Russell, correspondent for the Times of London, stood frozen, looking down into the valley. He wrote that he could not believe his own eyes, not because the spectacle was too magnificent, but because it was too absurd, too painful, and strangely beautiful in the way that only things of complete futility can ever truly be beautiful. Some of the British cavalry actually reached the Russian artillery position at the end of the valley. They broke through the smoke, cut down the Russian gunners, shattered the defensive line for a few minutes of brief chaos. But they arrived there with too few men, no infantry support, no one following behind, and they could not hold the position. The Russians quickly counterattacked. Those still alive had no choice but to turn their horses and flee. And then they had to ride back through that same valley one more time, while the Russian artillery kept firing. The entire catastrophe lasted around 20 minutes. 20 minutes to destroy nearly the entirety of one of the most elite cavalry units in the British Empire. When the last survivors returned to their starting position, 278 of the original 655 cavalrymen were dead or wounded. 400 horses lay in the valley below. The British Light Brigade, once a symbol of honor and discipline, had become a graveyard stretched across the smoke and mud of Crimea. Immediately after the battle, the blame began. Raglan blamed Lucan for misreading the order. Lucan blamed Nolan for pointing in the wrong direction. And Nolan, he was dead, with no chance to defend himself. Meanwhile, Cardigan, who had personally led the charge and who had survived, returned to England as a hero. He appeared at grand dinner parties, recounted the battle as a glorious tale. But there was one thing he never said publicly, that even before the charge began, he knew this was suicide. A few weeks after the battle, the poet Alfred Lord Tennyson wrote a poem. It spread rapidly across the newspapers, and in short order, it transformed that catastrophe into legend. The lines asked no questions about the mistake, made no mention of responsibility, said nothing about the incompetence of those in command. They simply celebrated courage. And the British at that time preferred that. A heroic story is always easier to accept than the truth, because the truth was not heroic at all. The truth was, Raglan's order was so vague it could be understood in 2 entirely different ways, depending simply on where you happened to be standing on the battlefield. The truth was, the British Army at that time had no mechanism whatsoever for verifying that an order had been correctly understood before hundreds of people rode into death. And the truth was, both Lucan and Cardigan sensed something was wrong. They knew this order seemed mistaken. They knew this attack made no sense, but neither had the courage or the willingness to ride up to that hill and ask Raglan a very simple question: where exactly do you want us to attack? And the most frightening thing of all is that Cardigan knew. He knew clearly that this was suicide, but he led the charge anyway. He survived, and for the rest of his life, he never publicly acknowledged it.
This is what makes the charge of the Light Brigade different from almost every other failure on this list. At the Battle of Cannae, the Romans had no idea they were walking into a trap. At the Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon made wrong decisions, but at least he believed he was right. But at the charge of the Light Brigade, everything was more frightening still. Because at least 2 people in the chain of command knew clearly the order was wrong. George Bingham, 3rd Earl of Lucan, had doubts. James Brudenell, 7th Earl of Cardigan, was nearly certain. And yet both of them did nothing. Not because they had no choice, but because in the culture of the 19th century British Army, a junior officer questioning a superior's order was something almost impossible to imagine. No rule forbade it, but no one did it. Because if you did, you would be seen as lacking discipline, lacking fighting spirit, lacking the qualities of a proper British officer. And that is precisely the problem. Discipline is what keeps an army from falling apart. But discipline, when it is stripped of critical thinking, becomes blind obedience. And blind obedience, when it meets a mistaken order, can kill more efficiently than any enemy. The 655 cavalrymen who rode into the valley that day did not do so because they had no fear. They had it. They simply belonged to a system in which they were not permitted to do anything else. The Crimean War went on for nearly 2 more years after Balaclava, and in the end the Allies won. But that victory could not undo what had happened in that valley on October 25th. Lord Raglan died in June 1855, just months before the war ended. The official cause was dysentery, but many believed he had been broken by exhaustion and by the weight of his own order. Lucan was recalled to England, quietly relieved of command, no grand tribunal, no apology, just a cold ending for a failed commander. And Cardigan, he became a national hero, invited to lavish gatherings, acclaimed and celebrated, asked again and again about that battle for the rest of his life, even as hundreds of the men under his command never came home. But the person who truly created change in the aftermath of the Crimea disaster was not a general, not an aristocrat, not a politician. She was a nurse, Florence Nightingale. When she arrived in Crimea, she discovered a horrifying truth. British soldiers were dying from disease and squalid conditions in far greater numbers than from enemy fire. And from that moment, she spent the rest of her life transforming military medicine and civilian medicine in Britain. That was the real lesson the British took from Crimea. It did not come from the generals. It did not come from the aristocracy. It came from the image of a woman carrying an oil lamp, moving quietly through hospital corridors in the middle of the night. The charge of the Light Brigade is not really just a story about war. It is the price of a system where no one is permitted to say no. What is frightening is not that no one recognized the mistake. Throughout that day, at least 3 people understood very clearly that things were going wrong. They saw the problem. They sensed something was wrong with the order. But the system rewarded obedience and punished dissent, to the point where staying silent had become the safest choice.
And that does not exist only in the 19th century British Army. You can see it anywhere, in a company where employees are afraid to tell the truth to those above them, in a team where no one dares challenge the person in the lead, or in any organization where compliance is valued more than honesty. The result is not always 278 people dead in a valley in Crimea, but the principle is always the same. When no one is permitted to speak the truth, those making decisions will act on incomplete information. And when that repeats often enough, disaster is only a matter of time. Raglan's order was vague. Nolan's gesture was unclear. But what truly killed 278 people that day was not the ambiguity. It was a culture in which no one was permitted to stop and ask for clarity before acting. 655 men rode into the valley. 278 of them did not come back. And throughout the entire afternoon, not one of them simply asked one more question. Chapter 8. The Battle of Mogadishu in 1993. Some failures happen because the enemy is too strong. Some happen because the plan is too poor. And some happen because people don't understand what kind of war they're fighting. Mogadishu in 1993 was the third kind. The mission that day was carefully planned. The force carrying it out was the elite of the American military, the most rigorously trained, the most modern equipped, the most battle-hardened. The objective was clear. The estimated time was 30 minutes. 30 minutes became 18 hours. 18 American soldiers died, more than 70 were wounded, and in the days that followed, images of American soldiers' bodies being dragged through the streets of Mogadishu appeared on television screens around the world. 3 weeks later, President Clinton ordered the complete withdrawal of all American forces from Somalia. But here is what makes Mogadishu different from every other failure on this list. In purely military terms, the Americans completed their mission. They captured their targets. They did exactly what they had been ordered to do. They won the battle and lost the war at the same time. And the real question is not why they lost. The real question is why a tactical victory could become a strategic catastrophe in a way that was so painful and so swift. To understand Mogadishu, you need to understand what Somalia looked like in 1993. Somalia was no longer a nation in any practical sense of the word. The central government had collapsed in 1991 after the dictator Siad Barre was overthrown. No replacement government, no national army, no police, no legal system. What replaced all of it was armed factions, dozens of them, large and small, each controlling a portion of territory, a portion of resources, and a portion of the population. They fought one another continuously, not for any clear political objective, because it was the only way to survive and hold power in an environment without rules. While the factions fought, the Somali people starved. In 1992, an estimated 300,000 Somalis died from famine and violence. International food aid shipments were intercepted and stolen by the factions before they could reach those who needed them. In December 1992, the United States led an international coalition into Somalia in Operation Restore Hope, aimed at protecting aid shipments and stabilizing the situation enough that people would stop dying of hunger. In the early months, that operation achieved real results. Food reached more people. Violence fell in some areas. But then the objective began to change, and that is when things started to go wrong. Among the armed factions in Somalia, the most powerful and the most aggressive was the force of General Mohammed Farah Aidid, who controlled most of the capital Mogadishu and its surroundings. Aidid did not welcome the presence of foreign troops on Somali soil. He understood that the stability America and the United Nations were trying to create would undermine his power that depended on chaos for its survival. In June 1993, his forces ambushed and killed 24 Pakistani peacekeepers who were inspecting a weapons cache. That was the moment the UN and the United States decided Aidid had to be removed. A UN resolution was passed, formally transforming Aidid from an armed faction to be contained into a war criminal to be captured. American Special Operations Forces were deployed to Somalia with the specific mission of finding and arresting him. In a decision people would later look back on with considerable skepticism, the United States placed a $25,000 bounty on anyone who provided information leading to Aidid's capture. That was an enormous sum in Somalia in 1993, but it also had a side effect no one had accounted for. When America put a price on Aidid's head, many Somalis no longer saw America as a humanitarian force that had come to help them. They saw America as a party to the Somali Civil War, taking sides against their adversary. And Aidid, who understood Somali politics better than any American officer, began framing the conflict in exactly those terms for the people of Mogadishu. He told them the Americans had not come to help Somalia, they had come to occupy it. Aidid was Somalia's defender against foreign power, and capturing him was not America's business. In the narrow streets of Mogadishu, that message spread faster than any counter-narrative the Americans could produce. In the summer of 1993, the United States sent to Somalia one of the most elite forces in the military. Task Force Ranger consisted of Delta Force operators, Rangers from the 3rd Battalion of the 75th Ranger Regiment, and pilots from the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, known as the Night Stalkers. Delta Force was the most secretive counter-terrorism unit in the American military, trained for hostage rescue and the elimination of high-value targets. The Rangers were elite infantry, trained for rapid deployment in any conditions. The Night Stalkers were the finest helicopter pilots in the world, specializing in flight in darkness and extreme conditions. These were the best people America could send. But there are things that even the best people cannot overcome when the conditions don't permit it. Before Task Force Ranger arrived, General William Garrison, the force commander, requested armored support, specifically the AC-130 Spectre gunship, an aircraft with devastating close air support capability at night. He also wanted M1 Abrams tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles to support the infantry in emergencies. All of those requests were denied. The reason given from Washington was that heavy weapons of that kind would send the wrong signal, that America was escalating the conflict rather than conducting a limited humanitarian operation. This was a political and image problem, not a military one, and in this instance, political judgment overrode military judgment. Garrison received his force and began carrying out capture operations inside the city of Mogadishu. In the 6 weeks before October 3rd, Task Force Ranger conducted 6 successful operations, capturing a number of Aidid's intermediaries and associates. Each operation was conducted in daylight, quickly, and concluded before Aidid's forces could mount an organized response. Then came the 7th operation. The afternoon of October 3, 1993, a source reported to Task Force Ranger that 2 senior aides to Aidid were present in a building in the Bakara Market District, the central market of Mogadishu, and the area most tightly controlled by Aidid's forces. This was intelligence they had been waiting weeks to receive. Not Aidid himself, but 2 figures important enough to act on immediately. Planning time was short. The operation was approved within a few hours. It would be a daylight mission like the 6 before it. Helicopters would insert Delta Force onto the roof of the target building to capture those inside. Rangers would fast rope down from helicopters to all 4 corners of the building to establish a perimeter. A vehicle convoy would drive in to carry the prisoners and the force back to base. Estimated total time, 30 minutes. No one brought extra water or food. No one thought it would be needed. At 3:32 in the afternoon, the helicopters lifted off from a base near the coast and headed toward the center of the city. 6 minutes into the operation, everything was still going to plan. Delta Force had breached the building and captured the targets. The Rangers were establishing the perimeter outside. The vehicle convoy was on its way. Then a Black Hawk was shot down. Not by a modern missile or a sophisticated air defense system, by an RPG-7 rocket-propelled grenade, a Cold War-era weapon so cheap that even impoverished militiamen could acquire it. The Black Hawk took the hit, went down, and crashed into a narrow street several hundred meters from the target building. Under standard American military procedure, when a helicopter is shot down, the immediate priority becomes protecting the survivors and ensuring the enemy cannot capture or kill them. Garrison ordered the force at the target building to move to the crash site. 10 minutes later, a second Black Hawk was shot down. This one fell further away, deeper inside the city. And at that point, the entire 30-minute plan collapsed. American forces were now dispersed across multiple locations inside the city. One group at the target building with the prisoners, 2 others trying to reach the 2 crash sites, the vehicle convoy trying to move through streets where Somali militiamen had erected barricades of rocks, wrecked cars, and anything heavy enough to block the way. And while all this was happening, the entire Bukhara market began to boil over.
What happened next was something no tactical plan Task Force Ranger had prepared for. All of Mogadishu heard the gunfire and the sound of helicopters going down, and a significant portion of the city's population, not everyone but enough, began pouring into the streets with weapons in their hands. Not because they were members of Aid's force, not because they were organized or commanded, but because over the preceding 6 months, the story that Aid and the clan leaders had been building of Americans arriving to occupy their country had taken deep root among many people. And when the helicopters fell, that story became action. The narrow streets of the Bukhara market, barely wide enough for 2 trucks to pass, became lethal labyrinths. Buildings packed tightly on both sides created perfect firing positions at every window, every rooftop, every wall corner. Somali militiamen knew every street, every shortcut, every hiding place. The American soldiers knew nothing. The first rescue convoy tried to enter the city and was torn apart by fire, lost multiple vehicles, and was forced to withdraw to base without reaching any of the locations. The second convoy tried the same and failed the same way. The American soldiers at the first crash site built a defensive perimeter around the wreckage and fought through the night under fire from every direction, not knowing when reinforcements might arrive. 2 Delta Force operators, Gary Gordon and Randy Shugart, requested permission to be inserted at the second crash site, where pilot Michael Durant had survived and was surrounded alone. Their request was denied twice. On the third request, they were given permission to go in. Gordon and Shugart rappelled down into a position surrounded on every side, fought until both were killed in defense of Durant. They knew they were going somewhere they were unlikely to come back from. Both were posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. The night of October 3, 1993, while American soldiers were fighting and dying in Bukhara Market, commanders at the base and in Washington faced a reality no one had prepared for. They needed armored vehicles to enter the city, and they had no armored vehicles. The very things Garrison had requested and been denied, tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, were now the only means of getting people in and out safely. Infantry soldiers could not move through those streets under fire from every direction without armor protecting them. Garrison had to call Pakistani and Malaysian forces stationed in Somalia under the UN flag and request that they send tanks and armored personnel carriers to rescue American soldiers. In the early hours of October 4th, an armored column of Pakistani tanks and Malaysian armored personnel carriers finally pushed into the city. It took many hours to move through streets full of barricades and militiamen, but they got there. American soldiers were brought out by climbing onto the armored vehicles, or in some cases running alongside on foot because there wasn't room inside. Many were severely wounded. At 6:30 in the morning on October 4th, 18 hours after it began, the operation was over. 18 American soldiers dead, more than 70 wounded, one pilot taken prisoner. On the Somali side, estimates ranged from 500 to more than 1,000 killed, mostly militiamen, but also civilians caught in the crossfire. October 4th, 1993. The first images appeared on television. The body of an American soldier being dragged through the streets of Mogadishu by a crowd shouting in triumph. Pilot Michael Durant, battered and wounded, staring directly into an enemy camera. Those images spread around the world within hours. Washington was shaken. Phones into the White House and Congress were overwhelmed. The American people who had supported the humanitarian mission in Somalia looked at those images and asked a question many had not been asking before. What are our soldiers dying for over there? Clinton, barely a year into his presidency, faced enormous political pressure. He spoke with advisors, with generals, with members of Congress. Everyone had different views on what to do next. But when images are powerful enough and public anger is sufficient, strategic analysis tends to lose. 3 weeks after Mogadishu, Clinton announced the complete withdrawal of all American forces from Somalia. The withdrawal deadline was set for March 1994. Aid, the man an entire American Special Operations Task Force had been sent to capture, was never captured. He continued to control Mogadishu until he died from a combat wound in 1996.
Mogadishu did not end in Somalia. 6 months after America left Somalia, the Rwandan genocide began. Over 100 days, approximately 800,000 Rwandans were killed, mostly by machetes and guns, wielded by Hutu militia. The United Nations had forces on the ground with sufficient numbers and capability to prevent most of the killing, if they had been authorized to act. They were not authorized. Directly shaped by what had happened in Mogadishu, Clinton and the American administration refused to intervene in Rwanda. They refused even to call what was happening a genocide, because doing so would have created pressure to act. Clinton later called the decision not to intervene in Rwanda one of the greatest regrets of his presidency. And further still, the Battle of Mogadishu left a lesson that others drew in their own way. Osama bin Laden, in interviews in the late 1990s, referenced Mogadishu as proof that America was weak, that when they saw the blood of their own soldiers, the Americans would run. He called Americans paper lions who looked powerful but would retreat when hit hard enough. That was a wrong lesson about America, as the events of September 11, 2001 and their aftermath would demonstrate. But it was a lesson that Mogadishu had created the conditions for being drawn. Mogadishu did not fail because Delta Force and the Rangers weren't good enough. They were exceptional warriors, fighting in the most demanding conditions imaginable, and most of them survived. No one can question the courage they showed that night. Mogadishu failed at higher levels. The first was uncontrolled mission creep. American forces had come to Somalia to protect humanitarian aid. That objective was clear, limited, and broadly supported. But step by small step, that mission expanded into political stabilization, then into containing an armed faction, then into hunting down a specific individual. Each expansion seemed reasonable at the moment it was decided, but taken together, they transformed a humanitarian mission into an urban combat operation without anyone stopping long enough to ask whether this was still the same mission. The second was the decision to deny armored vehicles. Garrison asked and was refused on political and image grounds. That is one of the clearest examples in modern military history of political judgment overriding military judgment with direct and measurable consequences. If tanks and armored vehicles had been available on the night of October 3rd, those 18 hours would have been far shorter and far fewer people would have died. The third, and this is the deepest, was the complete disconnect between the military objective and the strategic objective. Even if Task Force Ranger had captured Aidid, would that have actually solved Somalia's problem? Somalia had not collapsed because of Aidid. Aidid was a symptom of a society that had already broken apart, not the cause of the breaking. Removing him would have created a power vacuum that someone else would fill, possibly someone worse. That question was never clearly asked or answered before America escalated from protecting aid to hunting a faction. This is what makes Mogadishu stand apart from every other failure we have looked at in this series. At Cannae, the Romans lost militarily. At Waterloo, Napoleon lost militarily. At Gallipoli, the Allies lost militarily. But at Mogadishu, the Americans won militarily. They completed the mission. They captured the targets. And they still lost. They lost because the military victory appeared on television screens as images the public could not accept. They lost because there was no convincing answer to the question, what are our soldiers dying for? They lost because in the age of media, the war on the television screen sometimes matters more than the war on the ground. And that is the lesson that the post-Mogadishu world has never been able to forget, whether it wanted to or not. In every military intervention since that day, the first question is no longer whether we can win militarily. The first question is, if the worst possible images appear on screens tonight, do we have an answer? That question, right or wrong, has shaped every Western military intervention decision in the 3 decades since Mogadishu. Mogadishu teaches a lesson that anyone working in any field can recognize. Winning technically is not enough if you lose the narrative. The Americans had the better force, the better weapons, the better training. They completed the mission they were given. But Aidid understood something that Garrison and Washington did not grasp early enough. In Mogadishu in 1993, the real battlefield was not the narrow streets of Bakara Market. The real battlefield was the perception of the people of Mogadishu about who was fighting for them and who was fighting against them. And Aidid won that battle long before the first Black Hawk was shot down. That is the final lesson of this series. 10 battles, 10 failures, 10 different ways for things to fall apart. But looking back at all of them, from Cannae to Mogadishu, from a field in southern Italy to the narrow streets of Somalia, the same pattern keeps repeating across every era, across every empire, across every superpower without exception. They did not lose because the enemy was too strong. They lost because they did not understand clearly enough the situation they were in, did not listen carefully enough to the warnings being given, and did not ask the questions that needed to be asked before it was too late. That lesson is not only for generals or heads of state. It is for anyone who has to make important decisions under pressure. And the only question that matters is, the next time you stand before a decision like that, will you be the one who asks or the one who walks in without asking anything?